I think perhaps you picked up a theme that we see in the scripture passages for today. And that theme, of course, is forgiveness. We see that even in the Genesis passage. This part of Genesis is well after the fact that Joseph has already forgiven his brothers and received them, but they are worried now that their father has died, that Jacob has died, and now he's going to get his revenge. But Joseph doesn't. And because of that, there is a future for God's people. Theme in the gospel text is forgiveness. And when we think about forgiveness, on the one hand, it is quite simple. We just forgive. And to do that, we simply make up our mind that we are going to forgive the person. We make up our mind and we commit to that. It's not a complicated thing. It's not something that we have to figure out. It's pretty simple on one hand. But on the other hand, forgiveness can be very hard. Knowing what exactly forgiveness means and does not mean can be complicated. Who we are supposed to forgive sometimes is tricky. And so forgiveness, on one hand simple, on the other hand very hard. Who are we to forgive? Certainly Jesus is telling us that those who come and ask for forgiveness, we forgive them. 77 times if we have to. But what about those who don't ask for forgiveness? Or what about people groups that we never come in contact with? How are we to understand forgiveness? And I think that if we begin to look at what is behind forgiveness, we begin to answer that question. And what we see in forgiveness is that forgiveness works to turn around the destruction and the brokenness that sin brings and bears. That it stands to put a stop to the vengeance that comes, this repayment and this destruction. And forgiveness seeks to turn things around, to create new possibilities and a future. Now, it's important for us to understand that and see that, but it's important for us to realize what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not just ignoring sin or taking what someone does lightly or turning a blind eye to it. No, in fact, forgiveness takes sin very seriously. Forgiveness is not about not confronting sin. It is about not allowing sin to dominate and continue to destroy. I think we see this in the earlier part of this chapter, the portion that comes right before this. In fact, the reason that Peter is asking the question, Jesus is telling the church. He says, if someone sins against you, you go to that person, one-on-one. Go to them. And you talk it out. And you say, listen, this really hurt me. And maybe you weren't aware of that, but I want you to know. And you seek to restore the relationship. You seek to put an end to the destruction that sin and the brokenness is bringing. Willing to forgive and restore. If the person doesn't listen to you, Jesus says you bring a couple of witnesses. Then you have a couple of people that are open to listen to what's going on, to understand what's going on, to seek to restore. And if that doesn't work, then you bring them to the church. Not the building, not the institution, but the ecclesias, the gathering of believers. And you say, we're trying to get things restored here. We're trying to restore. And even if that doesn't work, well then you just put them aside. Because they refuse to allow things to be restored. And I think even then you forgive them. You forgive them by saying, I'm not going to allow the damage and destruction that you do to continue to dictate my life and to destroy me. I'm going to have to put you away, out of my way, so that that doesn't continue. And I think in that we can say, I am not going to identify you and understand you by what you have done to hurt me. I'm going to see that there is another you, that there is a better you. And I think that's what forgiveness does. Forgiveness is seeing that there's something beyond the person, beyond the sin that that person has committed. That you are walking into that possibility, the goodness of their possibility, and not holding on to and allowing the destruction to continue on. In fact, this response here, the question from Peter, there's a reason that he asked, do we forgive someone 7 times? And there's a reason for Jesus' answer. It goes back actually to the vengeance and the terror and the kind of out of hand that things had gotten to in the Genesis, in the 4th chapter of Genesis. In the 4th chapter of Genesis, we read about Cain and Abel. And Cain kills his brother Abel. And God finds out about that. And God has to do something to stop that destruction. Now, God doesn't take Cain's life. And Cain, but he sends him out, right? And Cain says, they're going to seek vengeance for me because I killed my brother. And so God puts a mark on Cain that says that if you harm him, vengeance will come to you 7-fold. It was meant to prevent vengeance from coming, for further death to happen. But being humans, being people, we kind of took that a little further, and it kind of got out of hand. And by the next generation, there was a man, the descendant, whose name is Lamech. And he comes up with this neat little poem. And he says, I killed a man who wounded me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech will be avenged 77 times. What Jesus is doing in this response to Peter is to say, we are turning the course. We are changing the vengefulness, this sin and this hate and all of this that continues to grow and grow. Forgiveness puts a stop to it. And if someone asks you to forgive, you do it so that you can provide a new future. Now, I know a lot of us have that kind of memorized as 70 times 7 times. And I'm not sure why the New Revised Standard Version translates it differently. Can't say for sure what's right or not. But the number really doesn't matter. Because if you're going to forgive someone 77 times, you've probably lost count anyway. And you're going to forgive them 490 times. So, the idea is that we forgive. And that in forgiveness, we put a stop to the destruction that sin brings. That we create a new possibility. That we create a new future. Now, I want to say something that I think is important. So forgiveness isn't about taking sin lightly. it takes it very seriously. In fact, it's trying to reverse problems of sin. And forgiveness is not just ignoring the bad things that happen to you. It's not turning a blind eye to them. That is not what forgiveness is. And what I want to say to you, forgiveness also works to put a stop to the terror, to the pain and destruction. So, if someone is hurting you, if someone is abusing you, if someone is doing something terrible and awful to you, forgiveness is not just ignoring that and doing nothing about that. It's not that we just let that go. You need to stop and do what you can to the extent of the law to stop people that may be harming you and hurting you. If you are being abused, get help to stop that. What forgiveness does is it says, I'm going to put a stop to this, but I'm going to see beyond the person and the sin that they commit. Now, you may have to distance yourself from that person, and that's okay. But you are going to see that they are more than that sin, and that there are possibilities. Forgiveness creates a new future because it works to put a stop to the effects of sin. So the sin is not going over and over and over again. But who is it that we need to forgive? How do we do that? The complexity of forgiveness also comes into the fact that are we supposed to forgive those who don't harm us but harm other people? The Sunflower is a book that's written by Simon Wiesenthal. And in this book he tells an event that happened to him. He was in a concentration camp in Germany. He's Jewish. And as a young man, he was in this camp. And he saw all the horrors that were taking place around him. Because he was young and strong, he had the opportunity to work outside of the camp, to do some work within the city. And as he was going to work one day, he was called out by one of the SS guards, called to go into this building. And he went in, and he sat there, and he just waited. And finally, he was brought into a German commander, soldier, who was dying. He was on his deathbed. And this commander wanted to talk to a young Jewish man. And so he just got to know him. He asked him questions. And then finally he got to why he was there. And he began to tell stories of the awful atrocities that he was a part of. He began to tell in detail what he had done to people just like him. How he allowed Jewish people to suffer. And he says, but here I am on my deathbed, and I'm sorry. And what I long for before I die is for a Jewish person to forgive me. Simon was involved. Hears this. And he knows what's happened to his own people, to his own family, and he just remains silent. And eventually, the man dies. Without the word of forgiveness. And Simon is kind of plagued by this. He thinks about it all the time. What was he supposed to do? What should he have done? And so in the book, The Sunflower, the first part ends with that question. If you were there, what would you have done? If you were there, what would you have done? Would you have remained silent? Would you have forgiven? Would you have not forgiven? And so he sent that out to a lot of the religious leaders around the world, wanting them to respond. And the second part of the book is their response. And some of the responses really kind of make me think and consider. One says that we as a people have no right to forgive on the behalf of another person. That he could not offer this soldier forgiveness because the soldier did not harm him. The people that he harmed were dead. And that was one train of thought. But is that what forgiveness seeks to do? It's worth thinking about, and that's what makes it complicated. Do we have the right to forgive on behalf of someone else? Is that even forgiveness? Other leaders said some powerful things. The Dalai Lama responded. And he told a story about one of his monks, his Tibetan monks, who had been in prison for years by the Chinese. Unlawfully imprisoned, mistreated. And after this monk was released, the Dalai Lama talked to him. And he asked him this question. He said, while you were in prison, what did you fear most? And the response surprised even the Dalai Lama. It was not what he expected. The monk said, what I feared most is that I would lose compassion for the Chinese. He did not want that sin, that brokenness to continue in him because he didn't want to perpetuate it. Desmond Tutu, who was a part of South Africa and their resurgence in the fight, said this. He said, forgiveness is not some nebulous thing. It's practical politics. Without forgiveness, there is no future. Without forgiveness, there is no future. When we forgive, we open up a new future. We see this in the story that Jesus tells. A powerful story here. Jesus says, let's consider this. We're talking about forgiveness. Let's lay this down and let's see what forgiveness looks like and what failing to forgive might look like. And so he tells the story about this king, this man who owned a lot of property. And in the story, the translation says that he called in his slaves. And that might be a good translation of the Greek word, but it doesn't help us understand the story here, because these weren't people that were owned by this man. These were more of his nobles. They were people underneath kind of the king who were in charge of land. We know that because of the debt that this man owes. He owes 10,000 talents. A talent represents 15 years of labor. 10,000 talents is an awful lot of money. So he's not a slave that's owned. He is a manager, a part of the kingdom. And he's taking on more than he can handle. He's not able to collect and provide what he's supposed to for the king. And he has this enormous debt, 10,000 talents. You guys do the math on that. 15 times 10,000 is how many years of labor he owes. And that is a debt he can't pay. And so he walks into this meeting without a future. He doesn't have a future because of the enormous debt. And the king says, I'm going to sell you. I'm going to sell your family and your children and all of you, and I'm going to throw you into prison until we get the money. Your future is gone. And he says, please, 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 I am going to do everything I can. Don't change my life. And the man had compassion. And he forgave him. And think about this. Forgiving that amount of debt. That's national level debt. That's a lot of money. And that's an amazing thing to do. But what it does is it gives gives the man his future. It gives him a new possibility. Now, what does he do with this new future? Even before he can get out of the palace, he sees a man who owes him money, and he owes him denarii, which is 1 day's wage. You see the difference? We're talking national debt and just a little bit of debt is the difference. And he puts his hand around his neck and he says, "You pay me." And he decides not to live into the future that the king has provided for him. He has decided to live back into the old system and the old ways. He sees someone that owes him and he is not willing to forgive. And because of that, the king hears about it and throws him into prison. Forgiveness provides us with a future. Forgiveness changes who we are. It changes the effect of sin. It changes the power of sin and gives us something new and something possible. Is it hard? Yeah. But it can be so beautiful, free, powerful. The movie Places in the Heart begins with a very graphic scene. It begins as a young black man who is drunk and is firing off a gun. It takes place in the 1930s in a small town in Texas. And in that opening scene, the sheriff of the town goes to stop, to settle down the situation so that he doesn't harm someone. And the young man who is drunk looks at the sheriff, puts the gun up, and accidentally shoots and kills him. It's the 1930s, so we know what happens to the young man. He's lynched. They drag his body behind the pickup truck. The rest of the movie is about his widow, the sheriff's widow, who is trying to save the farm. She's got to bring in the crop, the cotton crop. And to do that, she has to rely on different people from different backgrounds to make that happen. And so she welcomes into her home a man, a young black man who goes by Mose, who is gifted and knows the trade, but is not allowed to do that because of the color of his skin. She takes in a blind man to room, and together they make it happen, and they save the farm for that year. The end of the movie is a very powerful and jarring scene as much as the first. It happens in church. And the preacher is up there reading from 1 Corinthians 13. And they are passing out the communion plate. And the first people that receive communion is a man who has cheated on his wife. Then it circles around, and the next row are the men who were in the Klan. Not surprised to see them in the church in the 1930s, but there they are. Then it goes to other people, and then finally to the back row, and it is Mose, the black man, who helped out. What is he doing in the church? And then it goes to the widow's family. And then finally, she hands the tray over to her dead husband. And we get it. It's heaven. And then finally, the most powerful moment is that her husband, who has died, hands the communion, the plate of forgiveness, over to the young black man and child. Forgiven. Beautiful picture. Future. Is forgiveness hard? Yeah. It's not complicated, but it can be hard to do. But forgiveness forgiveness gives us a future. And the future that comes from forgiveness is our greatest hope. Our greatest hope. Thanks be to God.
Amen.